Hi there, it's Reed from Blue Bear Quilts, and I'm a QT creative, and I've created this quilt pattern called Dandelions in the Dusk. And it uses fabric called Midnight Blooms from QT Fabrics, and it was designed by the Morris Creative Group. So this is the pattern, and this pattern is shipping today to shops, and the fabric will also be shipping to shops, and it's going to be there in June of 2024. So if you like this pattern, be sure to contact your local quilt shop and make sure that they're going to have this pattern, Dandelions in the Dusk, using QT Fabrics line Midnight Blooms. Now let me show you what the quilt looks like. This is Dandelions in the Dusk. And you can see that it has these beautiful flowers kind of in a twilight scene, beautiful blues and oranges and cream colors, and several of the flowers that are contained in this quilt are actually dandelions, and that's where it got the name, Dandelions in the Dusk. And again, this is the fabric line from QT Fabrics called Midnight Blooms. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I made this quilt. So follow along and we'll get started. In order to make the Dandelions at Dusk quilt, we need some beautiful fabric from QT Fabrics. And this particular line is called Midnight Blooms. And you can see why I called it Dandelions at Dusk, because this quilt involves a panel, and the panel has these beautiful flowers with kind of a dark background, and so these are some dandelions, and they appear to be later in the day at dusk. So the panel has all these different beautiful flowers in it. And there's something like 20 different flowers on the panel, and I think we'll be using 16 of them in the quilt. So the other fabrics from that line that we'll be using to make the Dandelions at Dusk quilt will be this beautiful orange. It has like leaves and dots and flowers on it. Then this beautiful orange and royal blue. This beautiful navy and light blue, various shades of blue in this particular piece. And then there's this gorgeous light yellow background that has these very faint, what almost look like orange daisies on it. And then this is going to be our outside border fabric that will coordinate with all of these other fabrics, and also coordinates beautifully with the panel. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to cut up a panel like this when it has so many different pieces. So sometimes it can be kind of hard to determine how to cut up a panel like this because there may not be enough space in between, and so you have to make sure that you're cutting in the appropriate place. So the first thing that I do is look at the pattern and see what it says these pieces are supposed to be cut out. And the Dandelions at Dusk pattern says that these are supposed to be 7.5 inches. And so that probably includes a little bit around the square. So there should be at least 1/4 inch around, but the pattern actually says 1/2 inch. But oftentimes you need to verify that with the actual fabric. And so you take a square up ruler and you put the 1 by 1 lines. If you're left-handed, you'd put them in the upper left-hand corner. If you're right-handed, you'd put them in the upper right-hand corner. And then you look to see that there's at least 1/4 inch going all the way around the picture. And see, there's 7.5, and so there's close to 1/4 inch there. If I move that, that would be about 1/4 inch. It looks like there's close to 1/4 inch there. And down here, the 7.5 is right here, so there's about 1/8 of an inch there. There's about 1/8 of an inch there, close to 1/4 at the top, and we can move this down a little bit. So that's basically what I do, is make sure that there's going to be at least 7.5 inches around with a little bit of that extra gray showing. Then the next thing is like, where do you cut the piece? So for that, I know that the pattern said there needs to be at least 7.5 inches. So I take and line up a longer ruler like this and make sure that the 7.5 inches goes to the left of where I'm going to cut, and that there still is at least a 1/2 inch there, which there is. And I just look all the way down and make sure that it's lining up. And sometimes these panel images will be nice and straight, and sometimes they won't. And on this particular piece, it looks like they're pretty good. So I'm going to slide this up a little bit like this. And then I don't want the ruler to slip at all when I'm cutting, so I like to take and put one of these heavy weights on top of it. This is a 7-pound weight. And then I'm going to verify again that my lines didn't shift, that I'm basically at the 1/2 inch on the outside of these pieces, which it is. And I'm sorry if you can hear the lawnmower outside. I don't have any control over that. And then I'm just going to take and cut this along here. Still holding on to the ruler even though I have that weight. And then I'm going to move this off and I'm going to slide the piece up. So that I can get it where the next section is available for me to cut. And you try to have it be nice and flat and straight. And then we're going to continue lining it up with the 1/2 inch mark here. And you can see where it is there. And we're going to get a 1/2 inch down here. And that looks pretty good. So I'll put my weight in place again. And it looks like it shifted on me, so I'm going to move it back. And still keep my hand on the ruler. And cut along here. And so that now gives me this piece that's trimmed up that I can start working on. So the next thing I'm going to do is just take and trim in between these pieces so that they're a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to take, and I know that I need at least a 1/2 inch on either side, so that will be good. And that's going to be good. Whoops. And then these last two pieces, we'll trim between them. And so now we have individual pieces to work with that we know there's at least a 1/4 inch or more going all the way around, which will give us the 7.5 inch piece that we need. So now I'm going to go back to the square up ruler and again take and put that 1 by 1 in the upper left hand corner. And I want to make sure that there's at least a 1/4 inch. So there's a 1/4 inch there, a 1/4 inch there. Come down to the 7.5 here, there's about a 1/4 of an inch there. And then we need a 1/4 inch on this left side. So there's our 7.5 by 7.5. This actually looks pretty good. So I'm now going to take and trim up two sides. I'm going to trim up this side, and then I'm going to trim up this side. And then I'm going to flip this piece 180 degrees. And now I've already cut on this side and this side, so now I can actually take and put my 7.5 inch line on this right side that's been trimmed, and my 7.5 inch line on the bottom that's been trimmed, and get that point where the two things meet right in that corner. And basically these black lines and the spaces in between are supposed to be right on the very edge of where I trimmed. That's how these rulers work. So like if there's little dots, they're actually on the edge of the fabric. but just barely. And so we can see I have maybe about 1/8 of an inch on this side. So when you're working with these panels, it oftentimes is hard to get it so that you have an exact even amount all the way around, but you do the best that you can. Don't worry about it. The quilt's still going to look great. So there is a piece that's now been trimmed that's ready to go into the quilt. And you can see I have pretty much even edges all the way around. And that's what you want to try to accomplish when you're cutting your panel apart. So I'm going to keep cutting these out, and then I'll show you how we keep constructing the block. So this is a completed block. I call it the blue dusk. Like as the sun goes down, dusk, blue dusk block. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to make this block. So you have to start off with a panel piece. So here we have this beautiful flower. And the fabric line is called Midnight Blooms because these beautiful flowers are kind of surrounded by a dark blue, indicating like an early evening time where you can still see the flowers, but it's starting to get dark. So one of the things that makes this so easy is that you sew a small strip to another small strip to a larger strip, and then you subcut these strips into smaller pieces. And you need 2 of each of these for a block. And then you have to make some half square triangles, which are comprised of these pieces. And I cut these pieces out with my AccuQuilt cutter and an AccuQuilt cube, which contains the dies. And you notice like the way these shapes are, when you put them together, you sew from this point right here to this point right here, and you end up getting a perfect 1/4 inch and no dog ears when you're done. So if you can see that, you can see my stitching line is right there from point to point, and I press towards the dark, and when you press it, you end up with no dog ears. So you need to have 3 of these for each block, and then you need to have a couple strips, a smaller one and a larger one that have a square sewn on the end. So let me show you how the block goes together. So we start off by putting the panel piece here. We take and put one of these pieces up here and one of these pieces down here. We put a half square triangle there, another half square triangle there, another half square triangle there. Then we put the smaller one down here, and I guess you can't see that, I'll show you in a second, and the larger one over here. So I'll scooch this up so that you can see it. There we go. So again, we have the panel piece. We have one of those strip sets that have been subcut, and another strip set over here, and the 3 half square triangles, and then one of those strips with a square on the end, and another strip with a square on. And that's how easy it is to sew this together. So I take and basically sew these 3 pieces together, and I sew these 2 pieces together, and then I sew these 2 to the flower piece, and then I press towards the flower piece. I sew these 3 together, and I press this one this way because this section over here is pressed the other way, and then I flip it over and sew these 3 pieces on, and again press towards the flower piece. Then I sew this bottom piece on and press towards it, and sew this right piece on and press towards it. So there's one other interesting thing about making this Dandelions in the Dusk quilt, and that is that all of the blocks are constructed this exact same way. They all have those sub pieces, the strips with the squares on them, the 3/2 square triangles, and a flower piece in the upper left-hand corner. That's how they're all made. One really important thing, though, is that these blocks get rotated. And so if I show you with another one, let's start off like this. Okay, so right now that looks correct. The flower is upright. But if I rotate this, if I were to make this block like this with this piece and then rotate this, because some of the blocks are like that in the quilt, this is no longer right side up. So in order to get it right side up, we have to put it into the quilt like this, which means that when we sew all the blocks together the same way, some of them are going to be upright like this one was. Some of them are going to be rotated a quarter turn this way. Some of them are going to be upside down. And some of them are going to be rotated a quarter turn to the left. And the pattern tells you which blocks need to have these pieces turned which direction. So that's how easy it is to make the blue dusk block. And then there's one other type of block in there, and it is the blue flower dusk block. And the only real difference is that it's made with pieces like this instead. And again, it has the same white squares on the end, but these blue pieces become this blue flower instead. And so the blue flower dust blocks are made the exact same way, just substituting this blue flower fabric everywhere that you see the blue fabric. So when you are cutting these little subsections that go in the block here and here, you can actually do 2 at a time or 4 at a time, depending on how many of these strips you want to stack together. But by laying them right sides together or wrong sides together, you can cut multiples at a time, and it's going to make cutting these pieces go even quicker. So I'm just going to put the ruler here, get it lined up with the lines, cut along here, and then you can see I very easily have cut 2, and then just move the ruler down to the next section, and we'll cut 2 more. And it's just a very quick way of cutting these sub pieces. Now we have the blocks all sewn, and we've put them in rows, and in between the blocks we've put a piece of the background sashing. So in between each block there's a piece of background sashing, and then we're putting sashing rows in between the block with the blue cornerstones. And up here at the top you can see where I've sewn 2 rows together with the sashing strip and cornerstones in between. So why do we put sashing strips in quilt designs and cornerstones? Well, for this particular design, it was to give the blocks the illusion of floating on top of the background. You can see how the blocks are spun and they're not necessarily even with each other. So when there's this sashing in between them and the sashing rows, when it's all sewn together, and you'll see that when it's done, it's going to appear as though the blocks are floating on top of the quilt. So I'm going to continue sewing these rows together with the sashing rows in between. And then when it's all done, I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so we're all human. And when I was sewing these blocks together in rows, these upper 2 right here, I sewed them upside down. They need to be rotated 180 degrees. You can see that there is a blue box around the one on the left and a blue box around the right, and it should actually be this blue floral one that's next to it. So when something like that happens, Don't get all upset with yourself and give up on the project. All I did was take and unsew back past here so that this part is now loose, and unsewed that top sashing piece the same distance so it's loose to about there. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and flip this around 180 degrees. And then I'm going to take and sew these two back together, and then I'll sew this onto it and then the top on, and we'll be back in business. So we're all human, we all make mistakes, and if you can just unsew a part of a seam and fix it, that's all you need to do. I wanted to show you some close-up of the quilting on the Dandelions at Dusk Quilt. This quilt was quilted by Penny from Copper Penny Quilting in Clearwater, Florida. And she used a flower design. You can kind of see it there, how there's like petals going out in every direction. And it was a real appropriate quilting design for this particular quilt, because a lot of the flowers have that where the petals are radiating out. So that worked as a really cool design for this quilt. It's an all-over design that with a light orange thread works really well for this particular quilt. Thank you so much for watching the making of the Dandelions at Dusk Quilt. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to the Blue Bear Quilts channel. And when you do that, there's a little bell. If you hit that, you'll be notified every time I post a new video. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.